She's just a glorified janitor down at the Navy base. Honestly, Daniel, I'd look into a heavy life insurance policy if I were you, because that girl's paycheck won't even cover her own groceries. Ping, ping, ping. The sound of a heavy silver spoon striking the edge of a crystal champagne flute cut through the ballroom. It didn't sound like a wedding toast. To my ears, it sounded exactly like racking the slide of a 9mm pistol. The low jazz music playing from the corner speakers abruptly died. 200 faces turned toward the head table. A sea of tailored suits, dry-cleaned dresses, and stiff smiles, all staring up with a mix of quiet pity and eager disgust. Colonel James Carter, United States Marine Corps, retired. He stood right at the center of the head table, dominating the space the way he always did. His face was flushed a deep, ugly mottled red from 3 hours of throwing back straight Kentucky bourbon. He wasn't giving a father of the bride speech. He wasn't offering blessings. He was delivering a public execution. A few nervous, awkward chuckles rippled from the cheap seats in the back. A distant cousin coughed into a napkin. The silence in the room pressed down on my shoulders like a physical weight. The ballroom was sweltering. The venue management had packed 200 bodies into a space strictly designed for 150. The air conditioning was failing. The smell was suffocating, cheap rose wax candles melting onto polyester tablecloths, layered heavily over the sharp, sour stench of James's alcohol sweat. It was the kind of thick, dead air that made civilians loosen their ties and fan their faces. I didn't flinch. I didn't look down at my plate in shame. I sat perfectly still, my spine completely rigid against the back of the wooden chair. I kept my eyes locked dead on the center of his throat, right where the thick jugular vein pulsed against his stiff white shirt collar. I watched his chest rise and fall beneath his suit jacket. Short, shallow breaths. Rapid, uneven. The biological markers of an aging narcissist desperate for the room's absolute attention. He needed this. He thrived on it. He needed to shrink me down to absolute nothingness just so he could feel like a giant for 5 more minutes. Beneath the suffocating layers of tulle and tight, heavy satin of my wedding dress, my right calf burned. A jagged, dime-sized piece of shrapnel from a mortar shell in Kandahar was still buried deep in the muscle tissue. The trauma surgeons at Bagram Airfield had warned me it would ache when the barometric pressure dropped. They didn't mention it would feel like a white-hot iron spike when I had to stand perfectly still and let my own blood publicly disown me. I had been standing for 6 hours today, playing the good, quiet daughter, smiling for the flashes, nodding at relatives I hadn't seen in a decade. Not a single person in this packed room had asked if my leg hurt. Not a single person had asked if I needed to sit down for a minute. I let my gaze drift just a fraction of an inch to the left, scanning, calculating, 16 yards. That was the exact distance from my chair at the head table to the heavy oak double doors beneath the glowing red exit sign. 16 yards, unobstructed. If things went loud right now, I could drop 3 men, secure a path, and clear those doors in under 4 seconds. It was a useless calculation for a wedding reception, but it was the only way my brain knew how to process threats. Both of my hands were hidden under the heavy white damask tablecloth. My left hand rested perfectly still. My right hand lay flat against my thigh. Slowly, almost unconsciously, my thumb swept across the thick, hard ridge of dead skin on my right index finger. A permanent, ugly callus. The kind of hardened skin you only get from pulling a heavy combat trigger 10,000 times in the dark. A shadow suddenly blocked the warm light of the overhead chandelier. Vanessa, my older sister. She leaned heavily across the table, her perfectly manicured acrylic nails digging right into the white linen. She wore a forced, camera-ready smile that cut sharply across her heavily powdered face. But the smile didn't reach her cold, dead eyes. "You should be on your knees thanking him," she whispered. Her voice dropped low, sliding under the murmur of the crowd, sharp enough to cut bone. "Dad is the only reason you're not getting married in some dirty downtown courthouse. You ought to show some damn gratitude that he actually chipped in to pay for half of this run-down reception." I looked at her. I really looked at her. At the smug superiority radiating from her pores. She didn't know. None of them knew. James hadn't paid a single red cent for this wedding. Every dollar, every cheap rose candle, every drop of that bourbon he was currently sweating out came straight from my secure accounts. It was hazard pay, combat deployment bonuses, blood money drawn directly from Black Ops budgets they didn't even have the security clearance to know existed. I had funded the very stage they were using to humiliate me. But I didn't say a word. I didn't open my mouth. Explaining yourself is a weakness. It means you actually care about their verdict. I just stared flatly at her pulsing jugular until she finally broke eye contact, her smile faltering as she slinked back into her chair. Beside me, the wood of a chair creaked violently. Daniel, my husband, he was an architect, a civilian who built quiet, safe homes with clean lines. He knew absolutely nothing of the dark, violent corners of the world I operated in, but he knew enough to see his wife getting ripped apart in public. His jaw was locked tight. The veins in his forearms bulged against the dark fabric of his tuxedo sleeves. He planted his heavy boots hard on the marble floor, shifting his weight, bracing his shoulders to stand up. He was going to defend me. He was going to flip the table and end this right now. I didn't look at him. I just moved my left hand. I dropped it hard onto his thigh. I dug my fingers past the expensive fabric of his trousers right into the dense muscle above his knee. A sharp, brutal, punishing squeeze. It wasn't a request. It was a direct physical command from a superior officer. Hold the line. Do not engage. Sit the hell down. Daniel froze. His breath hitched. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a mix of helpless rage and confusion. I gave him a fraction of a nod. Barely a millimeter of movement. Just enough to let him know I had the perimeter secured. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving, and slowly let his weight settle back into the chair. Up at the podium, James saw my absolute silence. He mistook it for surrender. He thought he had successfully broken the stray dog. A smug, ugly grin spread across his red, sweaty face. He raised his champagne glass higher, sloshing the pale liquid over the rim onto his knuckles. He was eating up the silence. He was a god in his own mind. If you've ever had to bite your tongue and swallow your pride while a toxic family member tore you down in public, do me a favor. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment down below. Just type the word survive in the comments. Tell me I'm not the only one who knows exactly how heavy this kind of silence feels. James cleared his throat, pivoting his heavy shoulders away from our side of the table. He pointed his glass straight out into the crowd, aiming directly at the reserved VIP table near the front of the stage. But enough about my disappointment of a daughter. James boomed into the microphone, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. I didn't gather you all here just to talk about base cleaners. Let me show you people what a real soldier looks like, a man of actual honor, a man I respect enough to consider my own flesh and blood. The spotlight swung sharply across the dark ballroom. It locked onto a broad-shouldered man sitting quietly in the shadows, dressed in a flawless pitch-black military uniform. Lieutenant Commander Ethan Brooks pushed his chair back and stood up from the VIP table. He wore the United States Navy dress blues, pitch-black fabric, crisp white cover resting on the table, 3 rows of polished ribbons sitting heavy on his left chest, the gold trident warfare pin catching the yellow light of the cheap overhead chandeliers. He was the real deal. A Tier 1 operator. A man who made a living kicking indoors in the absolute worst corners of the globe. He offered a smooth, polite smile. The kind of empty smile you give to an old man who likes to hear his own voice. He raised his crystal champagne glass toward James. The crowd ate it up. 200 civilians clapping like trained seals. They loved the dark uniform. They loved the shiny medals. They had absolutely no idea what it actually took to earn them. The smell of roasted prime rib and stale perfume hung heavy in the warm air, mixing with the sickeningly sweet sound of their applause. James was practically glowing behind the podium. He had his prop. He had his ultimate weapon to show the room what a real success looked like. Ethan turned his head slowly. He followed standard social protocol. Acknowledge the father, then acknowledge the bride. His gaze swept across the long white table, past Daniel, past Vanessa, right to me. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I just sat there, my posture completely rigid against the hard wood of the chair, staring back at him with eyes that held zero warmth. zero humanity. The reaction was immediate, biological, uncontrollable. Ethan's smooth, camera-ready smile froze. The muscles in his cheeks twitched once, then completely collapsed. His pupils dilated so fast the dark centers swallowed the color of his eyes. The crystal glass in his right hand, the exact same hand that could drop a moving target at 800 yards in a crosswind, began to shake. A violent, visible tremor. The pale champagne sloshed wildly inside the flute. It spilled over the crystal rim, dripping down his thick knuckles and soaking into the pristine white cuff of his uniform shirt. He did not even seem to notice the wet stains spreading across his wrist. He stopped breathing. I watched his broad chest lock perfectly still. He recognized the face. He recognized the eyes. The last time he saw me, I was covered in fine gray sand and someone else's blood standing inside a concrete command bunker that smelled like cordite sweat and death. James saw absolutely none of it. He was too drunk on his own ego. He grabbed the microphone tighter, leaning heavily against the wooden podium. "Come on, Ethan." James barked a wet, ugly laugh, rumbling deep in his chest. "Why do you not come up here, teach this little base janitor a thing or two about actual discipline? God knows she could use a lesson from someone who actually matters." A fresh wave of laughter rolled through the sweltering ballroom. My cousin at table 4 slapped his knee. Vanessa sneered from behind her cloth napkin, her eyes flashing with pure petty victory. They thought it was a joke. Ethan did not laugh. A thick bead of cold sweat broke out on his right temple. It tracked slowly down his tan skin, cutting right across a pale, jagged shrapnel scar on his neck. His jaw clenched so hard I could hear his back teeth grinding from 16 yards away. The man was a highly calibrated killing machine, a Navy SEAL who had survived hell on Earth. And right now, he was looking at an old, fat, retired Marine who was blindly throwing matches into a room completely filled with gasoline. James had just ordered an active-duty special operations officer to publicly humiliate his own supreme commander. Ethan swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed heavily in his dry throat. He kept his eyes locked firmly on mine. He was completely ignoring the father of the bride. He was completely ignoring the 200 oblivious guests. He was waiting. His gaze held a desperate, silent question. "What are your orders?" The room finally started to notice the strange silence. The scattered laughter died out. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates stopped. The heavy, suffocating air in the ballroom suddenly felt like it had been sucked out through a vacuum. People shifted nervously in their uncomfortable wooden chairs. James frowned, tapping the top of the microphone with his thick finger, thinking the audio had cut out. I kept my hands hidden under the heavy damask tablecloth. I looked at the cold sweat shining on Ethan's face. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated terror swimming in his dark eyes. Then I moved. I tilted my chin up, exactly 1/4 of an inch. It was not a nod. It was an authorization. An invisible, lethal command passed between two people who spoke the dark, ugly language of war. Ethan exhaled, a harsh, ragged sound that scraped from his lungs. He slammed his crystal glass down onto the VIP table. The base of the flute shattered on impact, spraying sharp shards of glass and cheap champagne across the white linen. He did not care. He grabbed the back of his heavy oak chair and shoved it violently out of his way. Screech! The wooden legs ground harshly against the polished marble floor. The noise shrieked through the dead silent ballroom like heavy metal tearing apart. It was a violent, ugly sound. It made Daniel flinch beside me. Ethan stepped away from the table. He did not walk like a wedding guest. He walked like a soldier moving to secure a highly hostile target. Long, heavy, deliberate strides. His black leather dress shoes cracked against the stone floor. Crack, crack, crack. Every single step sounded like a steel hammer hitting an anvil. The crowd parted instinctively. People pulled their chairs in, shrinking back from the dark, overwhelming aura radiating off his large frame. James stood frozen at the podium, his mouth hanging slightly open, the microphone dangling uselessly in his loose grip. Vanessa sat completely paralyzed, her acrylic nails digging so hard into the table, her knuckles turned bone white. Ethan closed the 16 yards in a matter of seconds. He did not look at James. He walked right past the podium, the medals on his chest, clinking a cold, steady rhythm. He stopped dead exactly 3 feet in front of my chair. The ballroom held its breath. 200 people waited in absolute terrifying silence, watching, waiting to see if the Navy SEAL was going to drag the bride out of her chair by her throat. The ballroom was dead silent, the kind of thick, heavy quiet that makes your ears ring. Ethan Brooks stopped exactly 36 inches from the edge of my table. Not 35, not 37. Military precision drilled deep into his bone marrow. He stood tall, his broad chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. The warm light from the chandeliers caught the gold trident pinned above his left breast pocket. He did not look at James. He did not look at Vanessa. His eyes were locked dead on mine. His body snapped rigid. His heavy black leather shoes slammed together. Crack! The sound of his heels striking the polished marble was a sharp, violent gunshot in the stale air. His right hand snapped up, cutting a flawless, razor-sharp line through the heavy, suffocating heat of the room. The tip of his middle finger stopped dead at the outer edge of his right eyebrow, a perfect textbook salute. Not a casual greeting between friends, a total submission to absolute authority. He did not speak. He roared. A voice scraped raw from screaming orders over the deafening whine of Blackhawk helicopter rotors. A voice carrying the weight of thousands of hours of combat. Rear Admiral Julia Carter, Commander, Special Strategic Operations Division, permission to speak, ma'am. The words slammed into the walls and bounced back. They ripped through the cheap rose wax and the stale bourbon fumes. Crash! The crystal champagne flute slipped right through James's sweaty, trembling fingers. It hit the polished stone floor and exploded. Sharp shards of glass scattered outward, glittering under the lights. 200 people stopped breathing. The string quartet in the corner died instantly. The cellist's bow froze mid-stroke, producing a sickly, dying squeak that echoed in the vacuum of the room. I shifted my gaze to Vanessa. Her jaw had actually dropped. Her mouth hung open. The blood drained entirely from her heavily powdered face, leaving her looking like a cheap, discarded mannequin. The smugness, the petty, hateful superiority she had worn all night, completely gone. Replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. She shrank back in her wooden chair, trying to make herself as small as possible. Beside me, Daniel let out a long, ragged breath. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were wide, taking in the woman he had slept next to for 3 years. He was an architect. He built safe things. He was just realizing he had married the woman who authorized drone strikes in the dark. I did not smile. I did not puff out my chest. I did not feel a single ounce of triumph. I just felt tired. A deep, bone-crushing exhaustion. That title did not mean victory to me. It meant flag-draped coffins. It meant letters written to grieving mothers. It meant blood on my hands that no amount of scrubbing with harsh soap could ever wash off. I looked at Ethan's rigid posture. I kept my voice flat, low, dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. At ease, Commander. Ethan's hand snapped down instantly. His feet shifted shoulder-width apart. He clasped his hands behind his back. Parade rest. He executed the movement with a machine-like fluidity that made the civilians in the room look like sloppy, uncoordinated children. Up at the podium, James was having a total system failure. His face went from a mottled cherry red to a sickly pale gray. He grabbed the wooden edges of the podium with both hands. His knuckles turned bone white. The retired Marine colonel, the man who demanded respect simply for existing, was shrinking. What is this? James stammered. His voice was thin, reedy. The booming authority was entirely gone. Is this a joke, Ethan? What the hell are you doing? She's a base cleaner. She scrubs floors at the transit station. He was begging for Ethan to laugh, to slap his knee and call it a great prank. Ethan slowly turned his head. He did not move his broad shoulders, just his neck, like a heavy weapon turret locking onto a hostile target. The look in his dark eyes was no longer respectful. It was pure, unfiltered disgust. The kind of look you give a cockroach right before you step on it. Sir, Ethan said. The words sounded like a physical threat. 6 years ago, Operation Silent Port. You would not know the name because you do not have the security clearance to read the black ink on the files. Ethan took one slow, deliberate step toward the stage. Admiral Carter had the con. 3 minutes before my team was scheduled to extract from a highly compromised hot zone, She caught an intel leak. 3 minutes. Ethan swallowed hard. The muscle in his jaw ticked. If she had not made the call to hold our position and rain hell down on that compound, 23 men would have come home in aluminum transfer cases. My men, my brothers. Ethan pointed a thick, calloused finger straight at James's chest. I am breathing your air right now. I am standing in this room right now, solely because of your daughter. The words hit James physically. You could see the exact second his ego died. His broad shoulders caved in. The invisible medals he always wore on his civilian chest vanished into thin air. He let go of the podium like the wood had suddenly caught fire. He did not look at me. He couldn't. The shame was too heavy. The man who had spent his entire life terrified of being ordinary was suddenly faced with true, undeniable greatness, and it absolutely crushed him. James turned around. His shoulders slumped forward. He did not say another word. He shuffled off the stage, his black dress shoes dragging heavily across the carpet. He melted into the dark shadows of the hallway leading out of the ballroom. A total, humiliating, silent retreat. A broken man fleeing the battlefield. The ballroom sat frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody whispered. Then slowly from the back of the room, someone started clapping. A slow, hesitant sound. Then another joined in. Then table 4. Then the VIP table. Within 10 seconds, the entire room erupted. 200 people pushed their chairs back and stood up. A massive, deafening standing ovation. The applause washed over the tables loud and frantic. They were cheering for me. They were cheering for the Admiral. But I could not hear them. I closed my eyes. The sound of the applause warped in my ears. It twisted. The sharp, violent noise of James's shattered crystal champagne glass on the marble floor echoed deep inside my skull. It kept echoing. Changing pitch, shifting. It was no longer the sound of breaking crystal. The air conditioning in the ballroom felt suddenly wrong. Too cold, too artificial. My nostrils filled with the sharp metallic stench of fresh blood and burning cordite. The shattering glass turned into something heavy, something metallic. Ping! The sharp, unmistakable sound of a fragmentation grenade pin popping loose in a dark, suffocating bunker. The applause vanished. I was falling backward into the dark. James's crystal champagne flute shattered on the polished marble floor. But inside my head, the noise twisted. It warped. It did not sound like breaking glass. It sounded exactly like the sharp metallic pop of a fragmentation grenade pin. The heavy air conditioning of the ballroom vanished. Heat hit me. Brutal, suffocating heat. 110 degrees Fahrenheit. I was no longer sitting at a wedding table in Virginia. I was standing inside a reinforced concrete bunker on the outskirts of Kandahar, 6 years ago. Operation Silent Port. Fine gray sand coated the back of my throat. Every time I inhaled, it tasted like battery acid and copper. The air inside the tactical command bunker smelled like stale sweat, burning diesel fuel, and cordite. I was 28 years old. I stood perfectly still in front of a heavy bank of glowing monitors. The screens flickered, casting a sickly green light across the dark room. Red dots swarmed the digital map. Too many red dots. Ethan Brooks and his Unit Alpha team were pinned down. 23 Tier 1 operators trapped inside a crumbling warehouse. The extraction helicopters were 3 minutes out. But the intelligence report was bad. We had a massive leak. Hostile fighters were pouring into the sector from the north, flooding the narrow dirt streets like water from a broken dam. The radio on the metal console cracked. Static hissed sharp and loud in the quiet bunker. Then a voice broke through. It was a kid. 19, maybe 20 years old. A designated marksman positioned on a dirt rooftop 3 blocks away from the warehouse, providing overwatch for Ethan's team. Command, this is Overwatch 1. His voice was high, tight. The raw edges of panic were bleeding through the radio static. Heavy automatic gunfire echoed loudly in the background of his transmission. They are breaching the lower level. I have hostiles on the stairs. I cannot hold this position. Requesting immediate permission to fall back to the secondary rally point. Over. I stared at the green monitor. I watched the red dots moving on the screen. I did the math in my head. War is never about courage. It is always about math. If the sniper abandoned his rooftop, the hostiles would gain the high ground. They would have a direct line of sight down into the warehouse. They would bring rocket-propelled grenades. They would fire straight down through the collapsed roof and turn the building into a slaughterhouse. 3 minutes until the helicopters arrived. If the sniper retreated, 23 Navy SEALs would die in that warehouse. If the sniper stayed, he would die. 1 against 23. The radio cracked again. Command. They are coming through the door. Please advise, I need to move. The kid was terrified. He was looking right at his own death, and he was begging me for a way out. I pressed the heavy black button on the radio console. I did not hesitate. I did not let my voice shake. A commander cannot show fear because fear is contagious over a radio wave. I made my voice cold, sharp as a straight razor. Overwatch 1, this is command, negative on your request to fall back. Silence on the radio, just the heavy rhythmic thumping of bullets hitting concrete walls. Hold your position, I ordered. Lock down that stairwell. You will provide continuous covering fire for Alpha Team until the extraction birds are wheels up. That is a direct order. Acknowledge. The silence stretched. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. He knew. He was just a kid, but he was wearing the uniform. He knew exactly what that order meant. I had just signed his death warrant. I was trading his blood for Ethan's blood. The static hissed. Copy that command. His voice was no longer panicked. It was dead. Hollow. The flat voice of a ghost. Overwatch 1 holding the line. Tell my mother, An explosion ripped through the audio feed. A deafening, bone-rattling roar that shook the speakers. Then nothing. Just a long, flat hiss of dead air. The dead air morphed. It twisted in pitch, turning into the sound of 200 people clapping. I blinked. The green monitors vanished. The Kandahar heat disappeared. The freezing air conditioning of the ballroom rushed back into my lungs, drying the cold sweat on the back of my neck. I was back at the head table, the heavy tulle of my wedding dress pressed against my aching legs. The crowd was on their feet, a massive standing ovation. They were clapping so hard their hands probably hurt. They were looking at me with wide, respectful eyes. Admiral, an older man shouted from the back of the room. A true American hero. I kept my face perfectly still. My posture remained flawless. Underneath the thick white tablecloth, my right hand was clenched into a tight fist. I squeezed my fingers together so hard my nails cut straight through the skin of my palm. I felt a warm, sticky drop of blood roll down my wrist and soak into the lace of my dress. They loved the title. They loved the gold stars on the shoulder boards. They loved the idea of absolute power. They had absolutely no idea what power actually cost. They did not know that every single time I closed my eyes to sleep, I did not see shiny metals. I saw a 19-year-old kid bleeding out on a dirt roof in the desert. I did not hear applause. I heard the flat, endless static of a dead radio. The applause suddenly felt like physical blows against my ribs. Then, the cheering stopped, cut off entirely. The long, flat hiss in my head pitched upward. It became a sharp, continuous beep. The exact sound of a heart monitor flatlining in a trauma bay. The beep stretched longer and louder, piercing my eardrums until it violently transformed into a human voice. You planned this. I opened my eyes. The ghost of the dead sniper disappeared. The cold, empty, dead gaze of a commander returned to my face. Vanessa was standing over my table. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She slammed both of her hands down hard on the white linen, rattling the silver forks against the china plates. Vanessa leaned across the white linen tablecloth. Her acrylic nails dug into the fabric, snagging the expensive threads. Her chest heaved. The heavy layer of foundation on her face had cracked around her mouth. She looked exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. You set this up, she hissed. Her voice was thin and reedy, completely stripped of its usual arrogant bite. You set this whole thing up just to humiliate him. You planned this just to make Dad look like a fool in front of everyone. I did not stand up. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer her the respect of an argument. I just slowly turned my head and looked at her. "No, Vanessa," I said. My voice was flat, dead air. "I did not make him look like a fool. You did." She blinked confused. Her jaw worked, but no sound came out. "You spent the last 3 hours bragging to anyone who would listen about your high-level connections." I continued stating the facts like a sterile casualty report. "You bragged about your master's degree, but you just sat at the head table of a military event and watched an active-duty Tier 1 operator render a perfect salute to a base cleaner, and your brain completely failed to process the threat level." I leaned forward just an inch, closing the distance. "I hold a master's degree from Annapolis, graduated with honors in strategic warfare. You hold a piece of paper that says you know how to talk in a boardroom. Do not open your mouth to me again." The engagement lasted exactly 10 seconds. Tactical neutralization. Vanessa's mouth snapped shut. The remaining color drained from her neck. She sank back into her wooden chair, pulling her arms tight across her chest, like the air conditioning had suddenly dropped below freezing. She was done. I pushed my chair back and stood up. My right leg screamed in protest, the old Kandahar shrapnel grinding against the muscle. I ignored it. I reached down, gripped the heavy satin hem of my wedding dress, and walked away from the head table. I did not look back at Ethan. I did not look at the 200 guests who were still staring at me in stunned silence. I heard heavy boots falling in line behind me. Daniel. He kept exactly 3 paces back, covering my 6. He did not ask questions, he just provided security. I walked out of the bright, noisy ballroom and down the long, dim hallway. The air out here was stagnant. It smelled heavily of old dust, lemon floor polish, and damp walnut wood. I stopped in front of the heavy double doors of the venue's private library. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The library was dark. The only illumination came from a single dim amber lamp sitting on a large mahogany desk. Colonel James Carter was standing by the far window. His back was turned to the door. The proud, rigid posture of the Marine Corps was completely gone. His broad shoulders sagged inward. The expensive civilian suit jacket he had taken off lay crumpled carelessly on the leather sofa. The crisp white shirt underneath was deeply wrinkled and soaked through with cold sweat between his shoulder blades. The loud, booming giant who had commanded the ballroom 10 minutes ago was dead. The man standing by the window was just a tired, terrified old man. He heard the heavy click of the door closing behind me. He did not turn around. "How long?" James asked. His voice sounded like cracked glass scraping across gravel. 6 years at flag rank, I answered. Cold, precise data. He gripped the thick wooden windowsill. His knuckles were white. The silence in the dark room was suffocating. It was heavy enough to crush bone. I could hear his wet, rattling breathing from 10 feet away. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. It was a weak attempt to reclaim authority, a pathetic attempt to shift the blame to cover his own monumental humiliation. "You sit at my dinner table. You let me speak to you like you were nothing. Why the hell didn't you say something?" I let out a slow, measured breath. I looked at the back of his gray head. "Would it have changed anything, Dad?" I asked, my voice cutting cleanly through the stale air. "If I had thrown my rank in your face, would you have actually respected me, or would you have just used it? Would you have just used me as a shiny new trophy to show off to your buddies at the VFW hall?" He flinched. The words hit exactly where they were aimed. "You do not want a daughter," I said, watching his shoulders tremble. "You just want an audience. You want a prop to prove that you mattered." James took a slow, unsteady step backward. His leg bumped hard against the edge of the mahogany desk. He turned around. The amber light hit his face, exposing every deep, ugly line of his age. His face was twisted. The dark, arrogant fire in his eyes was completely extinguished. He looked hollowed out. He slowly collapsed into the heavy leather chair behind the desk. The leather groaned under his dead weight. "I gave them 30 years, James whispered. The anger was gone. Only a pathetic, naked fear remained. "I gave the Corps my entire life. I bled for them. And they retired me at Colonel. They shoved me out the door and replaced me with kids who had never even seen the jungle." He stared down at his shaking, liver-spotted hands. "I was terrified," he choked out, his voice cracking violently. I was absolutely terrified of being ordinary. I could not stand the thought that I peaked in a muddy trench 30 years ago. And then I looked at you, my youngest girl, and you had this quiet, this absolute calm. I hated it. I hated that you did not need anyone to tell you that you were strong. A single thick tear broke loose and tracked through the heavy wrinkles on his cheek. He did not bother to wipe it away. I failed you, James said to the empty room. I am a coward. He reached a trembling hand inside the breast pocket of his wrinkled white shirt. His fingers fumbled with the fabric for a second. He pulled out a thick sealed envelope. The paper was heavily yellowed around the edges. It looked ancient. He stared at it for a long second, his thumb rubbing over the dark faded ink on the front. Without looking up, James tossed the yellowed envelope onto the polished mahogany desk. It slid across the wood and stopped exactly 1 inch from the edge, right in front of me. The yellowed envelope sat completely still on the polished mahogany desk. I reached out and picked it up. The paper felt brittle and dry between my fingers. It smelled like old dust-damp cedar and the faint sweet scent of vanilla. My mother's perfume. She had been dead for 10 years, but the ghost of her scent was still trapped in the paper fibers. I slid my thumb under the loose flap and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was sharp and elegant. Cursive. Julia, the letter read, "You were never meant to live loudly. Let your father and your sister have the noise. Honor is not measured by the brass on your collar or the volume of your voice in a crowded room. It is measured by the weight you carry in the dark when absolutely nobody is watching." She knew. She had seen the quiet, heavy thing growing inside me since I was a kid. She knew I was built for the dark. A harsh, wet sound broke the heavy silence of the library. James was crying. It was not a dignified, quiet weeping. It was an ugly, heavy, wet sobbing that shook his thick shoulders. He buried his face in his large, liver-spotted hands. "I was jealous of you," he choked out, his voice muffled by his fingers. "Evelyn always looked at you like you were made of iron. You had this silence, this absolute, terrifying calm. I spent my whole damn life screaming just to make people look at me, and they just looked at you." I looked down at the retired Marine colonel, my own father, the man who had spent the last 3 hours trying to bury me under his own pathetic insecurities. I waited for the anger to come. I waited for the heat in my chest, the desire to crush him the rest of the way down into the dirt. I had the power to do it. One word and I could strip away the last shred of dignity he had left. But my chest was cold. I felt nothing but a deep, heavy pity. War teaches you a lot of ugly things. But the most painful lesson is learning that some people are already dead long before you pull the trigger. James Carter was a casualty of his own massive ego. I slowly folded the brittle paper along its original creases. I slipped it inside a hidden pocket in the heavy satin of my wedding dress. I closed the distance between us. I reached out and dropped my right hand onto his shoulder. The rough, thick calluses on my palm snagged against the expensive wool of his suit jacket. He flinched. He expected a physical blow. "Wipe your face, Dad," I said. The tone was flat, but the lethal edge was gone. "The reception cost me 20 grand. We are not wasting the open bar." He looked up at me. His eyes were heavily bloodshot. The sagging skin under them was swollen and dark. "I don't deserve it, Julia," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." I kept my hand on his shoulder. I pressed down just hard enough to ground his shaking frame. "Grace does not operate on a merit system," I said. "If it was about what you deserved, I would have left you in the dirt an hour ago. Get up, straighten your tie. We are going back out there." I turned and walked out of the dim library. I did not check to see if he followed. I walked back down the long hallway and pushed through the heavy double doors into the ballroom. The room was dead silent. 200 people sitting frozen in their wooden chairs. Nobody was eating. Nobody was drinking. They were just waiting. I walked to the center of the dance floor. I stopped and turned around. Heavy, slow footsteps echoed behind me. James stepped out of the hallway shadows. His face was pale, but his eyes were dry. He had pulled his suit jacket back on. He stopped exactly 10 feet away from me. He took a deep, ragged breath. His broad chest expanded. His spine snapped straight, locking violently into place. The slouch of the defeated old man vanished. Decades of Marine Corps muscle memory took over his bones. His heavy dress shoes slammed together. Crack! He raised his right hand. The movement was sharp, precise, cutting through the stale, suffocating air of the ballroom. His fingertips stopped perfectly at the edge of his right eyebrow. It was not a father looking at a daughter. It was an old, tired soldier rendering the highest possible honors to his supreme commander. A total public surrender. I stood perfectly still. I raised my chin. I brought my right hand up, executing a flawless, rigid salute in return. I held it for 3 full seconds. I dropped my hand. He dropped his. Order was restored. Ethan Brooks was standing near the VIP table. He watched the exchange with dark, unreadable eyes. He gave a single sharp nod. Respect. Not for the rank on my shoulders, but for the restraint. Daniel stepped out from the edge of the crowd, his heavy boots quiet on the marble floor. He didn't say a word. He just stood by my side, a solid anchor in a room full of ghosts. The string quartet slowly picked up their instruments. A low, slow jazz tune drifted back into the heat of the room. The civilians slowly went back to their drinks, speaking in hushed, nervous whispers. They would talk about this night for the rest of their lives. 3 hours later, the ballroom was completely empty. The cheap rose candles had burned down to pools of hard white wax. I stood outside on the heavy concrete balcony. The air was freezing. The damp, salty breeze rolling off the Elizabeth River whipped at my face, tearing the heavy white tulle veil from my hair. I let it blow wildly behind me. My right leg throbbed with a dull, heavy ache from the shrapnel, but I did not sit down. I just gripped the cold iron railing and looked out at the black water. The heavy glass door slid open behind me. James walked out onto the concrete. He didn't bring a drink. He walked over and stood next to me at the railing. He didn't look at me. He just stared out at the dark, moving water. We stood there in absolute silence for 10 minutes. Just the sound of the freezing wind and the distant low hum of a cargo ship moving through the channel. Your mother, James finally said, his voice a low, rough scrape against the wind. She would have been very proud of you tonight. I kept my eyes on the horizon. I know. He gripped the iron railing. His knuckles were bone white in the dark. I am too, he whispered. The words were barely louder than the river breeze, but they were there. A white flag pulled from the smoking ruins of a 30-year war. I did not say thank you. I did not hug him. We were not that kind of family. I just gave a slow, single nod. A thin gray line broke across the dark horizon in the east. The sun was coming up over the water. It caught the lower edges of the clouds, turning them the color of a bruised peach. I looked at the light. I let the freezing air fill my lungs. Let them have their loud voices. Let them have their cheap trophies and their desperate need to be seen. Let them scream into the void, just to prove they exist. True power is quiet. It sleeps in the dark, it pays the blood toll, and it never ever has to explain itself. If you know exactly what it feels like to carry a heavy silence while everyone else makes noise, hit the like button, leave a comment down below with the word quiet, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.